All right, y'all. So today, wanted to do a very quick review slash thoughts on the film I saw recently, which was called The Free State of Jones. This film came out in 2016, almost 10 years ago at this point, and was directed by Gary Ross and obviously stars Matthew McConaughey. So, what are my thoughts on this movie? So, what this movie is basically covering the story of Newton Knight and some of his ancestors, and basically the whole kind of story about this kind of little rebellion that happened down in Mississippi during the big rebellion that was the Confederacy during the American Civil War. It's usually a story that not really many people know about. And I didn't know about it until I heard about this movie. And it's a really fascinating and interesting story. And I think it's rife with movie potential. Now, I think this movie, just to give you my quick thoughts on it, it's all right. It's a pretty decent historical movie. It's almost good in a lot of areas. It's kind of a weird thing where this movie's faults are not necessarily with its source material, because the source material is very interesting, very fascinating, and I think there's a lot of pros of this movie. That's why I'll honestly say that this movie is probably pretty good. But there are some filmmaking errors that really drag it down, that doesn't make it as good as it possibly can be, and just a lot of weird decisions made with this movie. So I'm going to get into all of those. But first, I'm going to get into the pros. So the pros of this movie, the premise. The premise is very interesting. So basically, the general gist is this guy called Newton Knight, who, was a guy who was pretty damn liberal for his time, right? He was a farmer in Mississippi during the time when the secession crisis happened. And, he worked in Jones County. And he had a wife, he had a kid, and, he enlisted in the Confederate Army when the Confederacy tried to secure their independence. And it became very clear to a lot of poor farmers, not just him, that the war was kind of being fought over slavery. Now, like I said before everyone gets into political things, the slavery was the main issue that caused the American Civil War. There's not really too much debate about that. And ordinary, common Confederate soldiers did believe in the practice. Now, I will say this, most, not all. And like I said, people go to war for a variety of reasons. Some people go to defend their families. In this case, Newton Knight and some of his compatriots did that. Some people were just conscripted in the army because in 1862, technically, the first conscription act in America didn't even come from the United States. It came from the Confederacy because they desperately needed manpower by 1862. So it's a pretty fascinating and interesting thing. But Newton Knight was pretty damn progressive for his time. And the county he came from was actually Unionist. They did not want to leave the Union. Actually, there's some things I think they should have kept in the movie. For example, the fact that Jones County actually elected a representative for their county. And, when he got elected in 1861, he was sent to the secessionist convention to obviously vote on their behalf and vote no. And he kind of betrayed the county's trust. And from what I understand, he betrayed the county trust in exchange for a Confederate job higher up in the department. So basically, completely went against his own role that he was elected to. Crazy story. And it's one of the stories I wish they would have left in the movie, because it would have given some a little bit additional context to why everyone's so mad about the Confederacy down there. And basically, the general thing is that Newton Knight was conscripted. He became disillusioned with the war like a lot of Southerners because of stupid laws like the 20 Negro Law, which they mention in this movie. And he would go back to his county, and then they would try to get conscripts who ran away back into the army and sometimes kill them. Also, Confederate taxers would also love to take away supposedly 10% of people's goods for the war effort, but most likely was more. And this is shown in the movie as well. And basically, in Jones County, there was a little bit of a rebellion. Now, there's a lot of historical ambiguity here, because simply this is a case where there's not a lot of historical documentation. There was a few newspaper articles, obviously word of mouth, but nothing from directly the source himself too much, and from the events that happened. So this movie had to embellish, make up a few things in order to get the story right. And I'm completely fine with that. Now, I think the premise is great. This general story is extremely fascinating. I saw this movie a few years back, and I kind of liked it for the premise, and I still like it for the premise. The premise is very fascinating. And, this guy, too, he was, Newton Knight was also pretty progressive. He apparently didn't like slavery. He saw blacks as equals, something that was kind of a minority in Mississippi, right? And Jones County, even though they were mainly a unionist, I'm sure there was a lot of racist people and cultures and attitudes back then. But I think this movie and its rebellion should absolutely be championed. They championed and they fought against the right things. I mean, the South succeeded because they wanted to keep slavery. And who knows what the consequences could have been for that in the 21st century if it made it that far. So I think this movie is pretty damn good on that sort. I think the story is very interesting and it's well done. I also think the directing, it's fine. The lighting, the look of the movie looks definitely like an 1800s movie. So it looks fine. There's some really great shots, some really interesting angles. Some of the editing and some of the length of shots I do have a problem with. But I think it's really good, especially the opening shot where we track some soldiers marching on a field. It really gives you the sense how horrible the Civil War was, which the Civil War wasn't a horrible war. So absolutely, and it was well done. Matthew McConaughey. Now, people like to make fun of Matthew McConaughey, and rightfully so. I think he has a lot of things about him as an actor that people like to make fun of, Matthew McConaugheyisms. But I gotta say, he's really great in this movie, man. I think he really sold it as Newton Knight. I was really surprised by his performance. He was really good, personally. I thought he was a really good standing role. I think he was perfect for this role, and I think he nailed it. I think he did a really good job. He sold the character very well, and alongside a lot of the other major actors, they do pretty good. Now let's get into other good pros. The music is okay. I already mentioned the visuals. The action's pretty good, even though the editing, once again, I'll get to it. It's pretty good. And like I said, the premise itself is really fantastic. Now let's get into some of my little cons of this movie. This movie has a fantastic premise and absolutely is a story that deserves to be told. It just falls apart a little bit and doesn't make it a great movie because it has some filmmaking errors. Now, historical inaccuracies, there's really not too many in the movie. For example, I think Newton Knight deserted the army 2 times. They just cut it down to 1 time for simplicity in the movie, which I'm completely fine with. I think the first time, though, the version that the movie uses, I think he left home for different reasons. It wasn't just because he had to bury his son. I think it was another reason. I think it was because he had some domestic issues, with his wife, but I can't remember. That's not a horrible inaccuracy. I can get over it. But for the most part, I think that for other people, it's pretty damn accurate. Now, there's a lot of things. For example, the fact is there's a lot of ambiguity. Did Jones County, when they rebelled, people speculate, did they actually raise the Union flag? And the movie kind of suggests that they did. There's a scene that shows it. And they also mention that, if Sherman's not coming, we'll just create our own government. The Free State of Jones or something like that. Our own laws. Like I said, those are mostly fiction, just because, like I said, there's so much we don't know about this little rebellion. We don't exactly know what happened, what transpired, if they actually tried to create their own little country. We just simply don't know. I'm not really blaming the movie for that, just because there's just a lack of historical documentation on that part. My personal opinion, I think that they were definitely Unionists. I don't know if they raised the American flag, but they definitely, I think, rebelled and wanted Sherman to come down and absorb into the Union again, but Sherman never went down there. So it's kind of a very interesting thing, and I think, it could have been possible they tried to form a government, but I don't think it's most likely. I think they just probably wanted to join back to the Union. Now, finally, let's get into cons. One of the big problems with this movie, like I mentioned, is some of the filmmaking issues. The editing in this movie is a bit weird. Sometimes, for example, in action scenes, shots are not as fluid as they can be. There's some weird cutback shots, and there's some shots that just linger on for too much. And I just think that could have been fixed with editing. So I think another thing is that there's some of the weird editing in this movie kind of brings it down. I also think, too, the movie has they interspliced a real-life story about Newton Knight's ancestor, who, under Mississippi law, was technically black. Now, it doesn't make too much sense that he was, but apparently he was 1/8 black because Newton Knight, later in his life, had relations with a black woman, and they had a child. So, like I said, that was a very interesting story. It was a real story that happened. The biggest problem is that the filmmakers tried to intertwine it to the main story that's happening, and it just doesn't intertwine at all. It doesn't, the thing is, if you're going to have a story like that where you're going to have an back and forth cutting with this court case that's happening, you got to have it connect to events that happened in the past to that present, right? It's got to have a flow to it. And there's no flow in this movie, really, to those scenes. In my opinion, they should have just been either cut out, saved for a special feature, or just put as like an epilogue at the end of the movie instead of just having it randomly cut. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And I also think the movie's ending is too haphazard. The movie just randomly, just quickly ends. It's a depressing ending, naturally, because Reconstruction itself was sadly crushed by really bad South black laws. But the problem is that the ending's so haphazard, so lazily done, I really feel like. It just kind of ends. And it's just like, Jesus, I don't know. I feel like personally, while a lot of stuff this movie does right, there's just a lot of really odd editing and story and directing mistakes made in this movie that just bring it down and don't give it the level of quality that I would rate it higher. But yeah, the awkward court case, that should have been saved for an epilogue. And also the ending. The ending was too haphazard, too quickly finished. Doesn't make too much sense. But yeah, those are some of my big problems with the movie. Other than that, this is a pretty decent Civil War movie. I would recommend it to y'all. It shows a bit of Civil War history that I don't think a lot of people know about, and talks about very uncomfortable things that happened, especially after the Civil War, that are rarely talked about. It's just kind of a shame that I wish the filmmaking side of things was a bit better on this movie. But other than that, I think this is a pretty decent Civil War movie. So that's my quick thoughts on the Free State of Jones. Hopefully you all have a good day, and peace, y'all.